24 hours inside the most notorious prisons in the United Kingdom. HMP Belmarsh, HMP Frankland, HMP Manchester. The Gates of Hell. It's often called the UK's toughest prison. Located in the heart of London, HMP Belmarsh is not a place for the faint of heart. If you've ever wondered where the most dangerous criminals, from notorious gangsters to terrorists, are held in the UK, this is it. HMP Belmarsh isn't just a prison, it's a symbol of fear. A prison within a prison, that's how I'd describe it, says one former inmate. A phrase that captures the feeling of confinement within the cold, barbed wire fences of this high-security facility. How did it come to this? As we step behind those notorious gates, the stories that unfold reveal not only the terrifying conditions but also the human element of the lives trapped within. But first, let's take you inside. The shock of entry. On a dark winter morning, a newly convicted inmate is escorted through the massive iron gates of HMP Belmarsh. The wind is biting, and the sound of the prison's heavy steel doors echo in the distance. For most, it's the first time they've seen such high walls, sheer concrete with just a sliver of sky above. The towering walls of Belmarsh stand like giants, watching over the terrified faces of new arrivals. Prison officers, their eyes hidden behind cold, professional gazes, direct the new inmate to the admission hall. When you first get here, it's a different world. The air smells like fear. It hits you the moment you step inside, says former inmate Robert Smith *, who spent 5 years in Belmarsh for armed robbery. His voice, now calmer with time, recalls the overwhelming shock of that first day. A life on the other side of the prison walls, where decisions could mean life or death, had just become a permanent reality. The prison, designed to hold some of the UK's most dangerous and politically sensitive prisoners, doesn't waste time. The inmate is immediately processed, his personal belongings confiscated and catalogued. The guards speak in sharp tones, and there's no time for questions. You're not supposed to have any questions. You're supposed to listen, follow the rules, and adapt quickly. The elite's new home. HMP Belmarsh is infamous not just for the criminals it houses but for the sheer caliber of its inmates. Among them, Osama bin Laden's henchman, Abu Hamza, a convicted terrorist mastermind who once had the ear of radical networks worldwide. His story inside Belmarsh is chilling. According to court reports, he was placed under constant surveillance, locked down for 23 hours a day, and allowed only minimal contact with others. But he wasn't alone. Beside him were drug lords, hitmen, and other high-profile criminals whose actions shook the very core of UK society. Most inmates in Belmarsh are there for one reason: to be kept away from the world. The isolation they endure isn't just a physical one, it's psychological torture. With solitary confinement the norm for high-risk prisoners, there's no chance of escape, either physically or mentally. This is a prison built for control, for containment. And Belmarsh's long history of security breaches and attempted escapes only adds to its mythos. But what is it really like on the inside? Prison life, inside the walls. There's a rule, a silent rule, inside Belmarsh: you either fight or stay silent. You can't survive by just following orders, says another former inmate, John Grant *, who spent time in both Belmarsh and HMP Frankland. His eyes darken as he recounts a life marked by violence, but also survival. The sense of isolation from society pushes many men to extremes, and the fear of becoming prey within the prison walls is a constant threat. The daily grind inside Belmarsh isn't for the weak. Prisoners wake up to a strict routine, where every moment is controlled. They eat, sleep, and live in a constant state of tension, never knowing when something could break and the prison would erupt into violence. According to official prison records, fights between inmates are frequent, and the prison guards, though professional, are often caught in the middle of deadly confrontations. A glimpse into the shadow of Frankland. Just over 150 miles north of London lies another infamous institution, HMP Frankland, a prison known for housing some of the country's most dangerous criminals, including serial killers. Frankland's reputation isn't as publicized as Belmarsh's, but it holds its own notoriety. Known for housing the likes of Colin Ireland, a man who confessed to the murder of several gay men, and Ian Huntley, the infamous schoolteacher convicted of the murder of 2 schoolgirls, HMP Frankland is the place where the UK's deadliest criminals are forced to face the reality of their actions. But the atmosphere inside is vastly different from Belmarsh. The tension inside Frankland is more subtle, more hidden, as the more psychologically disturbed prisoners test the system in their own dangerous ways. Why did it have to be this way? The truth is, these are not just prisons for punishment. They are fortresses of control, where every inmate is seen as a threat either to the system or to society. The prison system in the UK has evolved, but the violence, the control, the suffering, all remain a part of the harsh landscape inside the walls. But what makes a place like Belmarsh or Frankland so powerful? Is it just the fear of the criminals it houses, or the society that created them? This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Robert Smith and John Grant are pseudonyms used for illustrative purposes in this story. This introduction sets the tone and narrative tension for a deep dive into these notorious prisons. It creates a mysterious and unsettling atmosphere while establishing the critical facts about their histories, operations, and the dangerous lives of the men inside. The unseen terror of HMP Frankland. After the cold, sterile world of HMP Belmarsh, where the harshest criminals are held in solitary confinement, a shift to HMP Frankland is unsettling in its own right. Nestled deep in the northern county of Durham, Frankland has earned its own reputation, not just as a high-security prison but as a madhouse for some of the UK's most infamous killers. While Belmarsh operates on the principle of total isolation, Frankland's atmosphere is one of psychological warfare, where the very minds of its inmates are pushed to their limits. The prisoners here are not just physically isolated, they are mentally tested, broken by the harsh conditions and the brutal reality of their surroundings. The unsettling calm of Frankland. Entering HMP Frankland feels like entering a different kind of prison. The gates are still high, the walls still thick, but the air is quieter, more eerie. The men inside Frankland don't just carry the weight of their crimes, they carry the weight of their souls, often lost to the very violence they perpetrated. The facility has housed some of the UK's most notorious criminals, including Ian Huntley, the man who brutally murdered 2 young girls, and Colin Ireland, a serial killer who preyed on gay men. Frankland is known for its dangerous mix of hardened criminals, gang leaders, and psychologically unstable men who are serving life sentences for unthinkable crimes. But what sets Frankland apart is the unpredictable nature of the violence that brews within. There are no grand riots, no public spectacles like the ones seen in other prisons. Instead, there's an eerie stillness that seems to hang in the air, as if the prison itself is waiting for something to happen. The inmates here live on the edge of madness, constantly walking the fine line between reality and delusion. The prison has a unique culture of fear, one that is quiet, almost invisible, but palpable. The men who shook the nation, Ian Huntley's time at Frankland. Perhaps one of the most infamous inmates ever to walk the halls of HMP Frankland is Ian Huntley. Convicted in 2002 for the murders of 2 schoolgirls, Huntley's crime was one of the most shocking in modern British history. His name became synonymous with evil, his face plastered on every front page, as the public demanded justice for the heinous crimes. Huntley's arrival at Frankland was a moment of profound change for the prison. His presence caused an immediate shift in the balance of power among the inmates. He wasn't just any convicted murderer, he was a man who had killed children, a man who had taken innocence from the world. This alone made him a target. Yet, Huntley wasn't just another inmate, his psychological state set him apart. During his early days in Frankland, he exhibited signs of delusional thinking, speaking to himself, muttering about being persecuted by other prisoners. The authorities weren't blind to this behavior. Huntley was placed under close observation in an attempt to prevent any harm to himself, but Frankland's psychological toll on its inhabitants meant that the men inside had no patience for weakness. Despite his infamous status, Huntley's life in prison wasn't marked by loud confrontations or overt violence. Rather, it was a slow burn, a constant mental grind that kept him isolated from the general population. Psychiatrists, according to reports, were constantly monitoring his state of mind, as they feared his fragile mental health might deteriorate in such an environment. His behavior became erratic, and for a man once viewed as a cold, calculating criminal, Frankland became a place that could break even the most hardened. The psychological breakdown of a killer. What happens to a man like Ian Huntley in a place like Frankland? The answer lies not just in the walls of the prison but in the mental collapse that the environment creates. Frankland is notorious for pushing its inmates beyond their limits. The psychological toll isn't just something the staff or outside world can see, it's something the inmates feel on a daily basis. Psychological torture is Frankland's cruelest weapon. The sense of being surrounded by criminals like Huntley, the sense of never truly being free, even within the concrete walls of the prison, is enough to unearth even the most resilient minds. It's a prison designed not just for containment but for psychic disintegration, where each day is a battle for sanity. The staff at Frankland often deal with inmates who have outgrown conventional punishment. Many are serving life sentences for crimes so monstrous that the idea of reform seems impossible. The constant fear of violence and mental breakdowns is ingrained into the lives of those behind bars. For inmates like Colin Ireland, Frankland was a place where the horror of their crimes was brought into sharper focus. Ireland, known as the Gay Slayer, murdered several men in brutal, violent acts, leaving the community shaken. His mind was a dark labyrinth, filled with hatred and paranoia. Like Huntley, Ireland's time in Frankland became an experience of mental collapse. His status as a serial killer made him a target within the prison, where the men who resided there had no sympathy for his crimes. Ireland's life behind bars became a study of how isolation, combined with the violence of the prison environment, slowly eats away at the human mind. Prison violence, the heart of Frankland's power. While HMP Belmarsh has a reputation for brutal, direct violence, Frankland operates on a different level of threat. Here, the violence is more subtle, often coming in the form of psychological warfare. The gangs inside Frankland work like silent predators, not with brute force but through intimidation, control, and fear. Reports from prison officers have stated that gang activity in Frankland is often silent, operating in the shadows. These gangs don't need to be loud, they don't need to make a scene. Their power lies in their ability to manipulate and control. They create a sense of fear among the inmates who are already struggling with the mental toll of prison life. One of the most dangerous games inmates play in Frankland is the constant battle for dominance. Gangs fight not just for control over the prison economy but for the control of minds, playing psychological games to break down rivals and recruit vulnerable inmates. These gangs know how to exploit weakness. Inmates like Huntley or Ireland would have been easy targets for manipulation, for those who wanted to use them as pawns in the deadly game that is life inside Frankland. But Frankland's true power lies in how mental pressure becomes just as dangerous as physical violence. The inmates who survive here are not necessarily the strongest, they are the ones who have mastered the art of mental resilience. Those who can survive the pressure of constant fear, who can fight against the emotional erosion of a life in isolation, are the ones who endure. Life after Frankland. But for those like Huntley and Ireland, life behind bars in Frankland is a reminder of the unforgiving nature of their crimes. After years of living within the walls of this psychological prison, they are left to face not just the consequences of their actions but the toll it has taken on their sanity. For some, the mental breakdown is a given. For others, like Frankland's long-term residents, it becomes a slow burn, a decline into madness that takes years to unfold. As inmates begin to deteriorate, the authorities are left with an impossible question: how do you deal with someone who has lost their humanity? And if the crime was evil enough, can the prison system ever truly rehabilitate them? Frankland's brutal combination of psychological warfare, physical confinement, and unrelenting fear means that the ultimate punishment is not just the sentence, they become prisoners of their own minds. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Ian Huntley and Colin Ireland are used as examples of infamous individuals connected with HMP Frankland, but the portrayal of their lives inside the prison is based on publicly available information, including court filings and news reports. HMP Manchester, the violent heart of prison power. In the heart of Manchester, within the industrial chaos of the UK's second-largest city, lies one of the most dangerous and unpredictable prisons in the country. HMP Manchester, also known as Strangeways, stands as a brutal symbol of violence, gang dominance, and unrelenting tension. Unlike HMP Belmarsh, with its strict solitary confinement approach, or HMP Frankland, where psychological warfare reigns supreme, Strangeways is defined by raw physical violence and overcrowding. Its reputation isn't just built on the notorious 1990 Strangeways riot, but on the brutal daily struggles that define life for its inhabitants. The dark history of Strangeways. In 1990, Strangeways made headlines when it became the site of the longest prison riot in UK history. The uprising was sparked by growing unrest among prisoners, driven by overcrowding, poor conditions, and a lack of adequate healthcare. What began as a protest soon escalated into a violent rebellion, as inmates seized control of parts of the prison, setting fires, and demanding better treatment. The riot lasted for 25 days, with hostages taken and the prison building severely damaged. According to official reports, the event caused significant structural damage, costing millions in repairs. But more than the physical damage, the riot symbolized a deeper issue: the sheer lack of control and the overwhelming desperation of the men inside. Inmates were not just protesting poor living conditions, they were protesting the system itself. Strangeways became a symbol of a deeper prison crisis that was not just confined to its walls but echoed across the UK's prison system. This was a tinderbox waiting to explode, and the riot brought the brokenness of the system into the public eye. Strangeways today, overcrowded, dangerous, and unforgiving. Though the 1990 riot is a part of its history, Strangeways continues to operate as one of the most dangerous facilities in the UK. The prison houses some of the UK's most violent offenders, including members of infamous prison gangs, drug lords, and serial criminals who have caused chaos both inside and outside the prison walls. Inmates who end up at Strangeways are usually there for one reason: they are too violent or too dangerous for other institutions. The prison itself is a place where tension and violence brew beneath the surface every day. Gang leaders from various factions use Strangeways as a stepping stone, either to solidify their grip on power inside or to continue their criminal enterprises once released. Gangs like the Cumbrian Mafia, Manchester's infamous drug networks, and even violent groups like the ITA, Irish Terrorist Army, have held influence over the prison, controlling smuggling operations, extorting weaker inmates, and even dictating the terms of life inside the facility. For some, life inside Strangeways is simply a matter of survival. The psychological toll of daily violence, intimidation, and threats weighs heavily on inmates, creating a dangerous atmosphere where the rule of law is often replaced by the rule of fear. Reports from former inmates describe the constant threat of violence in the air. You can feel it when you walk into Strangeways. It's like walking into a furnace, says Paul Matthews, a former inmate who spent 2 years in Strangeways for assault. Every moment you're there, you're thinking about surviving, nothing else. You're either part of the problem or trying to escape it. The culture of gang violence and control. At HMP Manchester, survival isn't just about avoiding physical confrontation. It's about choosing sides in a world dominated by prison gangs. The gang culture at Strangeways is not just a backdrop to daily life, it is the driving force behind much of the prison's violence. The lines between criminals and gang leaders often blur, with men willing to do anything to secure dominance over the prison's black market and social hierarchy. Gang-related activities are common. Smuggling, extortion, and drug trafficking thrive within Strangeways' walls, feeding the power dynamics among its inhabitants. Gangs don't just control territory, they control everything from food distribution to contraband access. What happens on the inside is often dictated by those who hold the financial and violent leverage. These gangs have their own set of rules. Loyalty is paramount, and betrayal is punished with brutal violence. Inmates caught in the middle of gang feuds have few options: join a faction or face a life of constant harassment. The gangs rule the yard, says Matthews, who witnessed multiple violent outbreaks during his time in Strangeways. If you don't want to get hurt, you either stay quiet or fall in line. The violence that erupts is often calculated and strategic. Fights are often about territory, the control of contraband, and asserting dominance over weaker factions. The psychological warfare is just as deadly. Former inmates report being constantly under threat, not just of physical harm but of mental manipulation by powerful gang figures. The only way to rise in Strangeways is through sheer brutality or by aligning yourself with the right people. The prison riot that changed Strangeways forever. While Strangeways is infamous for its day-to-day violence, it will forever be remembered for the 1990 riot that sparked a nationwide reckoning. The unrest began with a series of small protests that escalated into a full-scale rebellion. Frustrated inmates, fueled by anger over overcrowded conditions, poor treatment by guards, and inadequate healthcare, began to take control of the facility. According to reports, the riot was sparked by a perceived injustice, a disagreement over healthcare access. It was an issue that many inmates had been quietly protesting for months. But what began as a small protest quickly escalated into a full-blown riot. The prison erupted in chaos, with inmates setting fires, breaking windows, and taking control of several wings of the prison. Guards were taken hostage, and prisoners openly defied authority, demanding better living conditions and an end to the harsh treatment they had suffered for years. The riot spread like wildfire, and soon, the prison was consumed by flames. Media outlets across the UK watched in horror as the situation unfolded, with footage of the riot broadcast to the nation. It took 25 days for the riot to end, and by that time, the damage was done. More than 600 inmates participated in the rebellion, with at least 2 guards taken hostage. The damage to the prison was catastrophic, and the rebuilding process took years. Court filings from the time revealed that the riot led to the loss of millions in repairs, and the public outcry forced the UK government to take a hard look at its prison system. A warning to the system. The 1990 Strangeways riot remains a powerful symbol of the dire consequences of neglecting prison conditions. But in the years following, the prison system has yet to truly reform. Strangeways is still a place of violence, and while improvements have been made, the legacy of the riot looms large. For many, Strangeways is a warning: prison violence is a symptom, not the disease. HMP Manchester is a hotbed of tension. While it might not see the large-scale riots that made headlines in 1990, the everyday violence within its walls is just as dangerous. Prison officers, though trained to handle such situations, remain on edge as they navigate the unpredictability of life inside. What's clear, though, is that the legacy of Strangeways lives on. This isn't a place for rehabilitation. For those trapped behind its gates, it's a daily battle, one where survival is the only thing that matters. The price of power, inside the dark world of UK's prison gangs. The atmosphere inside HMP Manchester is not defined solely by violence, though it plays a central role. It's a place where the shadows are just as dangerous as the actual physical confrontations. The true power behind the prison lies in the invisible structures that control the flow of money, information, and survival, the prison gangs. These gangs do not just exist in the prison's physical space, they extend their influence into every corner of the system, where smuggling operations, drug deals, and protection rackets thrive. And for the men who are part of these organizations, loyalty means everything. The gang culture of Strangeways. In a place like Strangeways, dominance is measured not by how many punches you can throw but by how much you can control. The prison gangs here are organized, structured, and operate like criminal empires, running the black market inside the prison walls and dictating the rules of life for every single inmate. For the inmates in Strangeways, getting into one of these gangs is more than just about survival, it's about gaining power and protection. It's about carving out your own space in a world where everyone is a potential enemy. The first rule of Strangeways is simple: if you don't have a gang, you're vulnerable. I was a loner when I first came in, says Dave Matthews, a former member of the Cumbrian Mafia, a notorious gang that has its roots in the northern parts of the UK. It wasn't long before I realized that if you didn't align with someone, you were a target. You either join a gang or you end up getting hurt. The gangs in Strangeways are far from just a group of criminals, they are tight-knit organizations, often led by individuals with significant experience in crime. Their leaders are respected not just for their ability to commit brutal acts but for their ability to organize, manipulate, and control the system. In fact, many of these gang leaders see their time in Strangeways not as a sentence, but as an opportunity to increase their power, expand their criminal enterprises, and continue their influence, both inside and outside the prison. The black market of Strangeways. While Strangeways' most dangerous criminals are held behind steel bars, there is an even more insidious world lurking within the shadows, the black market that thrives off of the prison's overcrowding and lack of control. This is where the gangs make their money, and it's a world where currency isn't just money. In Strangeways, drugs, contraband, and protection are the most valuable assets. Prisoners who are not affiliated with a gang often face tremendous challenges. Contraband, including drugs, cell phones, alcohol, and even weapons, are smuggled in and out of Strangeways with alarming regularity. The gangs control these operations, using their influence over guards and other inmates to bring in items that the prison system would otherwise never allow. The Cumbrian Mafia, for instance, is known for running the drug trade within Strangeways. Their reach goes beyond the walls of the prison, with members operating on the outside as well, bringing in everything from cannabis to harder substances. Drugs are a currency inside Strangeways, they are traded for favors, protection, or used to pay off debts. The gangs don't just control the food or the phones, says Matthews, who witnessed the inner workings of Strangeways' black market during his time there. They control everything. Drugs, weapons, even information. If you're not in on it, you're out of the loop, and that's dangerous. Protection rackets, the real currency. At Strangeways, protection isn't just a service, it's a commodity. Those without protection live in constant fear of being attacked or manipulated by stronger factions. The gangs inside the prison offer protection, but it comes at a cost. A protection racket in Strangeways is a highly organized operation. The gangs charge weaker inmates for physical protection, and this often extends to a form of psychological control. Inmates who are deemed vulnerable are targeted by gangs looking to exploit them. They are either forced into paying for protection or are extorted in other ways. Protection isn't just about keeping you safe, explains Matthews. It's about control. The gangs offer you protection, but they also make sure they control your life. You don't make decisions anymore. They do. This idea of control extends beyond the protection racket. Gangs take over virtually every aspect of the inmates' lives, from the trade of contraband to the control of who is allowed to associate with whom. For those inmates who refuse to join a gang, life can become an endless struggle for survival. The protection racket isn't the only way gangs profit, either. They bargain for everything: food, clothing, and even privileges like extra time in the yard or access to better living conditions. And it's not just about the prison's internal economy, many gangs extend their power outside the prison walls, continuing their illicit activities once they're released. The legacy of gang control. The reality inside Strangeways is a cycle of power, control, and violence. Gangs control everything, and the more violent and manipulative the leader, the more likely they are to stay in control. But the violence isn't just about territory or dominance, it's about perpetuating power for the future. The power dynamics inside Strangeways are not static. Gangs are constantly competing, strategizing, and plotting. Those who rise to the top often do so through violent acts, including murder, extortion, and bribery. But it's not just the violence that ensures their success, it's the networking. Strangeways' most dangerous inmates are not isolated, they know people, and their influence reaches well beyond the prison walls. They have connections, says Matthews. It's all about who you know. They control the money, the drugs, the gangs. If you don't play by their rules, you're a target. Breaking the cycle, hope in the shadow of violence. While the gang culture in Strangeways seems inescapable, there are glimmers of hope. Some inmates, tired of the constant violence and fear, have managed to break free from the control of gangs. These individuals are often mentally strong and have a desire to leave behind the life of crime. However, breaking free isn't easy. Even those who manage to escape the hold of gang life are left with scars, psychological wounds that take years to heal. Prison isn't just about paying for the crimes you've committed, it's about the lasting impact of the system, and the way it changes the soul of those caught in it. The ever-present shadow. HMP Manchester stands as a symbol of the UK's prison system, and while reforms have been made since the 1990 Strangeways riot, it remains a dangerous and volatile environment. The gangs, the violence, and the psychological toll of incarceration continue to shape the lives of those behind bars. As long as the black market flourishes and the prisons are overcrowded, Strangeways will remain a symbol of the brokenness within the system. It's a place where power is gained not just through physical violence but through the control of minds, the manipulation of fears, and the willingness to exploit others. It's a place where men are stripped of their humanity, but it's also a place where survival becomes the ultimate game, and the price for survival is often far more than anyone should have to pay. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. A world behind bars. As we draw to the end of our journey through the dark, imposing walls of some of the UK's most notorious prisons, HMP Belmarsh, HMP Frankland, and HMP Manchester, we must ask ourselves, what have we learned from these institutions of confinement, violence, and power? What does it mean to live inside these walls, and more importantly, what does it mean for the people caught within them? The men we've discussed today, whether it's Ian Huntley, Colin Ireland, or the many gang members and dangerous criminals within these facilities, are not just names. They represent the failure and complexity of a system that continues to struggle with overcrowding, mental health issues, and the psychological effects of prolonged incarceration. Prisons like HMP Belmarsh and HMP Frankland are known as high-security facilities, meant to house only the most dangerous offenders. Yet, while they may be designed to keep the public safe, the reality inside these prisons often tells a different story. These institutions are designed to punish, but often, they break. They break not only the bodies of those who are imprisoned but also the minds, leading to a cycle of violence, mental deterioration, and, in many cases, a loss of humanity. But beyond the violent confrontations and gang control, there's something more unsettling about the stories we've explored today. These stories reveal the dehumanizing side of our criminal justice system, where individuals are reduced to numbers, where their past crimes become their identity, and where hope is a rare commodity. What happens to a person when they spend decades in an environment where the rules are clear, but the path to redemption seems impossible? When we look at HMP Manchester, or Strangeways, as it's often called, we see a prison that embodies everything wrong with the system. Overcrowded, underfunded, and rife with gang control, it's not just a place for criminals to serve their time. It's a place where the darkest parts of human nature are amplified, where survival requires more than just physical strength. It requires the ability to navigate a world where loyalty to the wrong people can mean the difference between life and death. And as we explored HMP Frankland, with its psychological isolation and mentally unstable inmates, we were forced to confront one of the most difficult questions of all: can a place like Frankland ever rehabilitate someone like Ian Huntley or Colin Ireland? These men have committed some of the most heinous crimes in modern UK history, but once they're behind bars, what happens to them next? Are they just abandoned, left to rot, or are there glimmers of hope buried in the midst of their psychological torment? What do we do when evil is too deeply embedded to fix? The true cost of confinement. Throughout history, prisons have been seen as a place to punish. But if we look closer, we see that prisons are often a place that reproduces crime. The gang culture, the extortion, the daily violence, these elements are not just symptoms of a broken system, they are often the outcome of a system that hasn't adapted to the needs of its people. Instead of focusing on rehabilitation, many prisons remain steeped in retribution, perpetuating a cycle that only ends when someone is either released, broken, or dead. The truth is, the prison system is failing. Overcrowded prisons, underfunded programs, and a lack of meaningful rehabilitation have created an environment where gangs thrive, where violence is a currency, and where mental health is a secondary concern. In many cases, inmates are not prepared for life outside the prison walls. They are left to navigate a world where their criminality and prison records follow them, even after they've paid their debts to society. It begs the question, what is the real price of confinement? Is it the loss of freedom? Or is it something deeper, an erosion of a person's humanity? A loss of dignity, a death of hope, and a society that has forgotten the individuals inside. The forgotten stories behind the bars. But behind every barred cell, there is a story, often one that goes unnoticed, overshadowed by the crimes these individuals committed or the violent crimes they may have been subjected to while incarcerated. Stories like Robert's, who fought tooth and nail just to survive the madness of life behind bars. I didn't want to be part of the violence, but you had no choice. I kept my head down, stayed out of trouble, and tried not to get noticed, says Robert, a former inmate who spent 7 years inside HMP Belmarsh for armed robbery. His voice wavers as he recounts the survival tactics that helped him endure, tactics that involved more than just avoiding physical confrontation. He learned to disengage emotionally, to shut off the world around him, but even then, the constant tension in the air took its toll. You walk out of that place and you feel like you've been hollowed out. There's nothing left of you, just a shell. Robert reflects on his release and the struggles he faced trying to reintegrate into society. But what about those who can't adapt? What about those who, like Ian Huntley or Colin Ireland, find themselves trapped in a system that doesn't offer a way out, a system that drowns them in their own despair? The broken system. When we look at prisons like Strangeways, Belmarsh, and Frankland, we're forced to reckon with an uncomfortable truth: these prisons were never designed to fix anyone. They were designed to contain. But in doing so, they often make the problems they were intended to solve even worse. Instead of rehabilitation, we've created factories of pain, where the only product is more pain, passed down through generations, passed down to the public, passed down to the very souls of those inside. So, what needs to change? For a system like this to work, we need to stop thinking about punishment and start thinking about restoration. We need to move beyond the idea of a criminal as someone who deserves to be locked away and forgotten, and start seeing them as people who need to be reintegrated into society. We need a system that addresses the root causes of crime, a system that emphasizes mental health, rehabilitation, and second chances. Until then, the stories we've shared here, the lives of Ian Huntley, Colin Ireland, and countless others, will continue to unfold behind bars, a tragic reminder of a system that was built to punish, not heal. End credits. Thank you for joining us on this journey through some of the UK's most infamous prisons. This documentary serves as a reflection on the state of the prison system, where the cycle of crime, gang control, and mental health deterioration remain at the heart of the debate on how we treat those who have broken the law. If you found this story impactful, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth documentaries. Your engagement helps bring these stories to light. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The cycle that never ends: what happens after release. The documentary has taken you deep inside Belmarsh, Frankland, and Strangeways, but there is one part of the story that most documentaries avoid. One that is just as dark, just as unsettling, and just as important to understanding why these prisons hold such a notorious place in the United Kingdom. What happens when the gates open? What happens when a man who has spent years, sometimes decades, in Belmarsh's isolation cells or Frankland's psychological crucible is suddenly pushed back into society? What happens when an inmate hardened by the corridors of Strangeways, shaped by pressure, fear, and gang control, is told, "You're free now"? That moment, the release, is the silent chapter almost no one sees. And it starts here. The final walk to the gate. The walk to the exit is slow. Purposeful. He's escorted by two officers who have seen this scene hundreds of times. For them, it's routine. For the man leaving, it's surreal. The final door at the end of the corridor is unlike any other in the prison. It is smaller, quieter, almost unremarkable. But for every inmate who approaches it, it feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. Because on the other side is a world he no longer understands. The officers pause. One of them says the same line he said to countless others. Good luck. Those two words feel both honest and hollow. The inmate steps through. The door shuts behind him with a sound he will hear in his dreams for years, heavy metal clamping into place. For the first time in years, he breathes unfiltered air. For the first time in years, he looks up at the sky with no fences slicing it into pieces. But freedom isn't a clean break. It's a shockwave. A world that moved on without them. Freedom doesn't feel like freedom. Not at first. A man released after 10 or 20 years finds himself stepping into a world that kept moving even as his life froze inside cell walls. Streets feel louder. People walk faster. Technology looks like it belongs to another planet. A former inmate once said in an interview, "I didn't know how to cross a road. The cars looked different. The money looked different. Everything felt too bright." The world he returns to barely resembles the one he left. Phones. Cameras. Digital payments. Even buses. Everything is unfamiliar. And for men who spent years surviving on instinct, fear, and prediction inside prison yards, the outside world feels unpredictable in a completely different way. Inside, danger was everywhere, but it was predictable danger. Outside, the dangers are invisible. Bills. Rent. Work. Judgment. Stigma. Poverty. The slow erosion of a man who expected violence but never expected loneliness. The weight of a prison record. For many released inmates, their sentence continues long after they've left the building. Job applications ask about criminal history. Housing forms require disclosures. Many companies refuse to hire former prisoners. Landlords turn them away. One former inmate put it plainly. You don't get released. You just get moved to a bigger prison where you're the only inmate. Organizations exist to help, but the scale of the problem is massive. Most men leaving Belmarsh, Frankland, or Manchester carry more than their sentence with them. They carry the habits that kept them alive inside. Suspicion. Hyper-awareness. Difficulty trusting others. Difficulty being alone. A fear of enclosed spaces, and a fear of open ones. The prison follows them everywhere. The shadow of gangs after release. For inmates who were tied to gangs, the outside world isn't freedom, it's another arena. Some try to walk away from their old groups, but gangs inside prisons do not operate alone. They have connections in the outside world. Networks. People. Systems. Leaving a gang isn't simple. And for some, it isn't allowed. A former inmate from Strangeways described it like this. When you join a gang inside, you think you're doing it to survive. But you're signing a contract you can't read. When you leave prison, the contract leaves with you. Not all ex-gang members face retaliation, but many face pressure. To rejoin. To repay debts. To participate in operations outside. The cycle continues, not because men want it to, but because breaking it often feels impossible. Trying to start over. Some men genuinely try to rebuild. They take courses inside. They speak to counselors. They attend workshops, religious services, and rehabilitation programs. Some reconnect with their families, children now grown, partners who waited years, parents who aged while hoping their sons would return whole. But rebuilding a life requires something prison rarely gives. Stability. The first night out is often the hardest. You would think it ends with celebration, with joy, with relief. For many, it ends with panic, restlessness, and an overwhelming sense of exposure. A bed too soft. A room too quiet. A world too large. They wake up at 5 a.m. automatically because prison routine never left their bones. They sit at the edge of the bed, hands clasped, waiting for instructions that will never come. The structure that imprisoned them also shaped them, and now they are left to rebuild themselves from fragments. When freedom leads back to the beginning. Statistics in the UK indicate that for many released inmates, reoffending is common, not because they want to commit crimes but because they cannot find a place in the world they re-entered. Employment, housing, mental health services, and community support often fall short. Some end up turning back to the only system they understood. The underground networks they learned inside. Others reoffend simply to return to the only place where they know how to live. One man released from Belmarsh said, "I didn't know how to be outside. I didn't know how to be a person without a number. I broke a shop window just to get arrested again." He didn't want freedom. He wanted familiarity. The system failed him long before he failed himself. The unseen victims. There's another side to this cycle, one often forgotten. The families. Mothers who waited decades. Partners who watched their lives freeze. Children who grew up with a parent they never fully knew. When an inmate is released, families are expected to pick up the pieces. But trauma doesn't just belong to the inmate, it spreads. It changes everyone connected to them. And rebuilding those relationships takes years, sometimes a lifetime. Some succeed. Many break under the weight. Roots of the cycle. The cycle persists because the prison system wasn't built to rehabilitate at scale. It was built to contain. Belmarsh was built to isolate the dangerous. Frankland to hold the disturbed. Strangeways to punish the violent. But none were built to help people become something other than what led them inside. And so, the gate opens, and the cycle continues. A question with no easy answer. So now we return to the question we asked at the very beginning of this documentary. What does it mean to live 24 hours inside the most notorious prisons in the UK? But perhaps the better question is, what does it mean to live after you've survived them? Some escape the cycle. Some do not. Many never fully recover. And as long as a system focuses more on surviving than rebuilding. As long as prisons are places where violence organizes itself into hierarchy and order. As long as the world outside cannot catch the men who fall through the cracks. The cycle will continue. Not because people are broken. But because the system is. There is a truth buried deep beneath the surface of Belmarsh, Frankland, and Manchester. A truth rarely spoken on camera, rarely acknowledged in reports, and almost never admitted by the state. It is this. The prison system does not simply contain dangerous men, it manufactures them. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But through a slow, grinding network of social failures, bureaucratic indifference, and institutional design that funnels certain young men into a predictable, almost inevitable destination. A blunt reality documented across decades of criminal justice reports in the United Kingdom. And to understand the prisons we've explored, their gangs, their violence, their psychological toll, we must step outside the walls for a moment. We must look at the machinery that pushes young people toward these facilities long before they commit their first crime. Because most inmates do not begin their story in a prison cell. They begin it in a neighborhood the rest of society has forgotten. The early pipeline. Long before a man stands under the looming gates of Belmarsh, he has likely walked through corridors just as cold, the narrow hallways of failing schools, understaffed youth centers, unstable homes. For decades, criminologists have identified a pattern. High-security prisoners often come from low-security childhoods. Meaning, little stability, little support, and little chance. Not every child who grows up in poverty becomes a criminal, far from it. But almost every long-term prisoner in these facilities grew up in a world marked by absent support systems, chronic instability, danger normalized at an early age, communities saturated with crime, gangs, or violence, schools unable to intervene early enough. A former governor of HMP Manchester said in an interview years ago, "By the time they get to us, society had already stepped away from them." His words were not meant to excuse crime, but to explain its roots. Inside the communities many inmates come from, there is a sense of compression. Life narrows early. Choices shrink. And as opportunities tighten, certain paths become more visible than others. One inmate from Frankland, interviewed under anonymity, said, "I never thought I'd end up in prison. But when everyone around you is surviving, not living, you stop thinking long-term. You think one decision at a time. And those decisions, one after another, eventually accumulate into something irreversible. Broken homes, broken paths." A large percentage of the inmates held in the UK's Category A prisons grew up in homes marked by instability, documented in numerous criminal justice reports. Some experienced domestic struggles. Some faced neglect. Others lived between temporary accommodations, moving from one cramped flat to another, attending 3 or 4 different schools in the span of a single childhood. Stability is not a small thing. It is an invisible scaffolding that holds a person's life together. Without it, the world feels unpredictable. People feel unreliable. Systems feel hostile. And in that environment, dangers feel more familiar than opportunities. One young man interviewed after release from Belmarsh described it like this. "Chaos becomes normal. Violence becomes normal. Then you end up in prison and they tell you it's time to change. But all you've known is reacting to the next threat." For many men who eventually land in high-security facilities, their childhoods operate by the same rules as prison life. Always be alert. Trust no one fully. Show no fear. Respond quickly to threats. Keep your emotions hidden. Strength equals safety. Weakness invites danger. The frightening part is this. By the time they enter the criminal justice system, their internal operating system is already programmed for survival. And the institutions they enter, youth detention, jails, eventually prisons, reinforce every lesson they learned on the streets. The education they never got. When examining the early lives of long-term prisoners, one pattern emerges over and over. Interrupted education. Not because they lacked intelligence, many are far more articulate than people assume. Not because they were unwilling, but because their environment did not allow learning to flourish. Some were frequently moved between temporary housing. Some had responsibilities at home no child should carry. Some had to navigate unsafe neighborhoods just to reach school. Some entered classrooms carrying fears from the night before, and no space to speak it. One former Strangeways inmate put it plainly. "School was never about learning. It was where I went until something bad happened." Educational support systems often spotted their struggles too late. A warning sign. A suspension. A behavior note. A referral. Each one a small nudge away from mainstream opportunities, and a step closer to systems designed for punishment. And when learning is interrupted early, the opportunities to recover shrink drastically. Youth offending, the first fork in the road. The first encounter with the law is rarely the moment that determines a criminal's fate. But it often reveals how society responds to them. Some receive support. Diversion programs. Mentorship. Counseling. Community service. Others, especially those from marginalized communities, receive harsher enforcement, quicker arrests, and fewer second chances. Studies in the UK repeatedly show disparities in youth justice outcomes. And the consequences of that early response ripple through the years. One young man interviewed for a BBC documentary recalled. My mate got a warning. I got remanded. That changed everything. Early experiences with the legal system leave a mark. A sense of being watched. A belief that authority is not there to protect. A feeling of inevitability, as though the system is a conveyor belt rather than a safety net. And so the cycle tightens. Gang identity, the substitute family. Gangs inside prison did not begin inside prison. For many young men who eventually end up in Belmarsh or Strangeways, gangs provided what their environment could not. Protection. Community. Hierarchy. Identity. Consistency. Belonging. But there is a cost. Gangs build loyalty through pressure and expectation. They demand obedience. They punish betrayal. They offer family in exchange for freedom. Inside the prison system, this dynamic intensifies. You don't join for crime, one former gang member said. You join because standing alone is dangerous. In neighborhoods where danger is normal and institutions feel distant, gangs become the only visible structure. And so when these individuals enter the adult prison system, they already have alliances, rivalries, and internal codes shaped by years of hardened social reality. Prison doesn't create gang loyalty. It amplifies it. Because inside, gangs are no longer just a choice. They are a survival mechanism. When survival becomes identity. As childhood dissolves into adolescence, the rules shift, but the environment rarely does. In communities marked by instability, young people learn quickly that survival requires a version of maturity that has nothing to do with age. They learn to read subtle threats. They learn which streets are safe at which hours. They learn where not to look and where not to linger. They learn which moods at home mean danger and which mean temporary peace. This emotional vigilance becomes second nature, a quiet radar pulsing beneath every interaction. And years later, when these same individuals walk into places like Belmarsh, that radar becomes their most valuable skill. A former HMP Manchester inmate once said during an interview. Prison didn't change me. It just matched the world I was already living in. His words reflect a painful truth. Prison reinforces the survival identity that was formed long before the crime. Inside Belmarsh, the instinct to remain unreadable becomes necessary. Inside Strangeways, the instinct to align with powerful groups becomes essential. Inside Frankland, every emotional wall built during childhood becomes reinforced by the institution's silence and psychological strain. Criminologists refer to this as institutional mirroring, when the prison environment reflects the emotional climate a person was exposed to long before they committed a crime. The tragedy is simple. By the time the prison receives them, the system has already shaped them. The machinery of poverty. Behind crime, behind imprisonment, behind the creation of violent men, lies a machinery more powerful than individual choices. Poverty. Not just economic poverty, though that plays a role. But poverty in every dimension. Poverty of opportunity. Poverty of safety. Poverty of stable role models. Poverty of community investment. Poverty of trust in institutions. This type of poverty creates an invisible but powerful gravitational pull. It reshapes what feels possible, realistic, or attainable. A criminology professor once described it like this. Crime is not created by poverty, it is created by the pressure that comes from living in a system that doesn't support you. People in under-resourced communities are forced to make decisions under pressure, pressure that middle-class families rarely see. In these conditions, conflict escalates faster. Trust erodes quicker. Impulsive choices become defense mechanisms. Long-term planning feels unrealistic. Emotional regulation becomes harder. Risky behavior becomes normalized. When survival becomes the priority, choices narrow. And when choices narrow, pathways to prison widen. The state arrives too late. In many cases, the first government institution that engages deeply with someone on this path is not a school or a social worker, it is a court. For some, it is their first direct interaction with the state. A judge. A probation officer. A police officer. Not a teacher. Not a mentor. Not a community worker. The irony is harsh. The system appears only at the point of punishment. Never at the point of prevention. Reports from the UK Ministry of Justice repeatedly underline this problem. Early interventions work, but they're underfunded, understaffed, and often inconsistent. Community resources dry up, but enforcement budgets increase. A former youth worker summed it up with brutal accuracy. We get pennies to keep them out of prison. They get millions to keep them in. By the time the system fully turns its gaze toward an at-risk youth, the trajectory is already formed. Not inevitable, but deeply familiar. How prison reinforces the earlier damage. Most people imagine prison as a place of punishment or rehabilitation. But for many inmates, prison feels more like a continuation of the environment they've always lived in, just more concentrated. Prison reinforces hypervigilance, distrust, emotional withdrawal, defensive behavior, allegiance to peer groups, calculated survival strategies. The behaviors that helped them survive childhood now help them survive incarceration. One sociologist who studied high-security prisoners noted, "Prison doesn't undo trauma, it calcifies it." Inside Belmarsh, childhood instincts are sharpened. Inside Frankland, emotional distancing becomes self-protection. Inside Manchester, group identity becomes a shield against threat. In other words, prison completes the transformation that poverty and instability began. The dangerous men of high-security prisons are often the final product of a long chain of societal failures. And when they eventually commit crimes that shock the nation, the public sees only the final act, never the years of compounding damage that shaped the person long before the police ever intervened. When the system fears its own creation. This is the part that policymakers rarely say out loud. Many of the inmates inside the UK's toughest prisons were shaped by the very systems that now fear them. The child who couldn't speak about what happened at home becomes the adult who doesn't speak in interrogations.